Welcome to Upon This Rock. This is our online midweek Bible study from Solid Rock Drogheda. We're studying the book of Acts. We're going through it verse by verse, and we're now at episode 28, which has only taken us so far to about halfway through Acts chapter 13. Now, before we start studying the word, Janice, as always, is going to lead us in a worship song and invite you to worship along with her. After that, we'll get into our Bible study. And when I'm introducing that study portion, you'll hear me introducing myself again. That's because we record that section for radio broadcasts. But for now, let's worship with Janice.
I shall not fear.
Thank you so much to Janice. I'm Nick Park, and this is Upon This Rock. It's a verse-by-verse Bible study where we take a book of the Bible and we go through it, we read every single word, we look at every verse, we miss nothing out. We want to get the full counsel of God, line upon line, precept upon precept. And we're currently in Acts chapter 13. This is episode 28. And we've got now to verse 14, which is where Paul and Barnabas, well, he started off as Saul, but in our last episode we saw how his name was changed to Paul. And Saul and Barnabas set out from Antioch in Syria, and they've been to Cyprus, and they had an amazing power encounter, and then they went on to Pergia in Pamphylia. And we're told that John Mark, that had travelled with them, the author of Mark's Gospel, he left them, and that we'll find out more about that a little bit later on in the book of Acts. But right now we're joining it at Acts chapter 13 and verse 14. It says, "From Perga they went on to Pisidian Antioch, and on the Sabbath they entered the synagogue and sat down. And after the reading from the law and the prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them, saying, 'Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak.'" So they've gone from Perga on to Pisidian Antioch, and that's quite a journey. It's about 135 miles, but it's a climb. I mean, you actually start at sea level and you go up to an altitude of 3,600 feet. But that was where the Lord had brought them to another Antioch. They had set out originally on their missionary journey from the church in Antioch, which was Syrian Antioch. But there was two cities called Antioch in the ancient world, at least two. And there was the Antioch in Syria, where they'd come from. And this is Antioch in Pisidia, which is actually in Galatia. Basically, Galatia would include where Antioch was, and also Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. And we're told in Galatians, because Paul writes in Galatians about this, he says, "The first time I came to preach with you, I was weak, and I came to you because of a bodily ailment." And quite possibly that the most likely reason for that is that it was something like malaria. And so Paul had to get away from the coast and get up into the mountains, into the altitude, where there wouldn't be the problems with mosquitoes and everything else. It would be much healthier for somebody with malaria. So that's based on what Paul said in Galatians to the people, including here in Pisidian Antioch. We believe that's probably what was taking place there. And they went to the synagogue. Paul's called to be an apostle to the Gentiles, but they're still following this pattern of going to the Jews first. So they go to the synagogue and they sit there, because the pattern in the synagogue was they'd have readings, they'd have worship, and then they would invite somebody to speak, particularly if there was somebody educated there. Well, they invited Paul to get up and speak. Well, actually, they addressed this to both Paul and Barnabas, but it's Paul that gets up. Even though Barnabas was the senior one when they started out on this journey, it seems to be acknowledged that Paul is the more powerful preacher. And so they invited them to speak. Now, why? Had they heard of Paul? Had his reputation gone before him? Or maybe it was just politeness, when somebody's there for the first time and you say, "How are you doing? Do you want to say something?" So it could easily have been something as simple as that. But verse 16, "Standing up, Paul motioned with his hand and said, 'Fellow Israelites and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me. The God of the people of Israel chose our ancestors. He made the people prosper during their stay in Egypt. With mighty power, he led them out of that country. For about 40 years, he endured their conduct in the wilderness." That's a great way of putting it. He endured their conduct. "And he overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, giving their land to his people as their inheritance. All this took about 450 years. Now, a little phrase there. It says, "Standing up, Paul motioned with his hand." This is something that we read about Paul doing elsewhere, both in Acts 21, when he gave a speech on the steps of the temple, and also in Acts 26, when he was standing in front of a high official. It says that before he began to speak, he motioned with his hand. Some people have speculated as to what that might be, but probably the key to this is in the previous chapter, Acts chapter 12, where it says that Peter, when he was released from prison, went to speak to the people that were at the prayer meeting in John Mark's mother's house, and that there Peter motioned with his hand for silence, so that because they were all amazed and everyone was like, what's going on? So he motions with his hand for silence. So this is Paul probably doing the same thing. Which certainly makes sense on the steps of the temple when people were wanting to lynch him, and also in Acts 26 when there would have been those there who were opposed to him and wanted to see him basically murdered and killed for being a blasphemer. And so here, well, it may be that there were people who weren't happy that Paul had been asked to speak. Maybe his reputation had gone before him, including his conversion to Christ. And so it may be that some people in the synagogue were muttering and giving out, and so he held up his hand for silence before he began to speak. But certainly the audience here, as he says from his first words, he says, "Fellow Israelites and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me." The audience here included Jews, but even though it was in a synagogue, it wasn't just Jews. They were Gentile worshippers. And Luke might even just slip this in here into this passage to let us remember that there would have been Gentile worshippers there. Because remember, Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts were both written to a man called Theophilus, a lover of God. And that's generally believed to be a Gentile who was worshipping God and worshipping Jesus and wanted to know the truth. So there were Gentiles that wanted to worship and wanted to know more about the God of Israel. And Paul's message here, it lays it follows a very familiar course for when Paul or Stephen or Peter are preaching to Jews. He starts by laying a foundation from Old Testament history, not in as much detail as Stephen did in Acts chapter 7, but still along similar lines. He says, let's start with what we all agree about, and then we'll take this and show how this is actually the basis for believing in Jesus. So, verse 20, after this, he says, all this took about 450 years, and after this God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. And after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, "I have found David son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do." So, as Paul is very briefly laying out this New Testament history, he clearly divides their history into several periods. There's a period of the patriarchs, so we're talking Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and from that coming the 12 tribes. But then he moves into captivity in Egypt and deliverance from Egypt and conquest of the land. So we're talking about the days of Moses and the days of Joshua. And then after that, you have the judges. So he says that God gave them judges. And then there was Samuel, who was a judge and also a prophet. But then the people asked for a king. So there was Saul, the first king of Israel. And then, of course, David, who came after him. Now, as Paul is moving through this, he's moving towards a goal. Now, some people look at history and they just see it as a chain of events, one thing after another. History is so much more than that. History is moving towards an end point. It's moving towards a purpose. And maybe the other people in the synagogue thought history was just like a chain of events, or some people think history is like a circle that just goes round and round and repeats itself. But no, Paul's knows where he's going with this. And so now he gets there. Verse 23, from this man's descendants, David's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Saviour Jesus, as he promised Before the coming of Jesus, John preached repentance and baptism to all the people of Israel. As John was completing his work, he said, "Who do you suppose I am? I am not the one you are looking for, but there's one coming after me whose sandals I am not worthy to untie." So here's the goal. Here's the moment whenever the synagogue leaders probably regretted asking Paul to speak, because everything up to this point was fine. They all agreed, yeah, Abraham, yeah, we all believe in Abraham, the wandering in the wilderness, Moses and Joshua and all of that stuff. We believe in all of that. But now David, yeah, we all believe in David. But now he starts talking about the son of David and not Solomon. He's talking about Jesus. Now, it's interesting, actually, that Paul then starts talking about John the Baptist, but it makes sense in the way that he's approaching this with sort of quick run through the Old Testament, because John the Baptist was the link between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In fact, some people, even though he's in the New Testament, some people describe John the Baptist as the last of the Old Testament prophets, by the way that he behaved and dressed and preached and everything else. So he's the link between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But it's, we don't read a lot in Acts or the epistles about John the Baptist. And so this is fascinating that Paul zeroes in on John the Baptist in this way. Verse 26, "Fellow children of Abraham and you God-fearing Gentiles, it is to us that this message of salvation has been sent. The people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus, yet in condemning him, they fulfilled the words of the prophet that are read every Sabbath. Though they found no proper ground for a death sentence, they asked Pilate to have him executed." So now, not only is he making it about Jesus, but the Jewish religious leadership in Jerusalem, they're right in his line of fire. This is a little bit like visiting a Catholic church and then slamming the Pope. But that's what Paul's doing. He's saying, Jesus was the son of David, and the religious leadership in Jerusalem, they missed it. Verse 29, "When they had carried out, the religious leaders, when they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he was seen by those who had travelled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people." So the reality and the power of the resurrection was a key element in early Christian preaching. They preached about the cross, but they preached powerfully about the resurrection because it was the proof that the cross achieved what it was meant to do. And also, the preaching about the resurrection was so powerful at this time because, it's not like trying to do this 2,000 years later and people says, well, I don't believe in the resurrection. There were loads of eyewitnesses still around. It was something that was very difficult for their opponents to deny. Verse 32, "We tell you the good news, what God promised our ancestors, he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. As it is written in the second Psalm, you are my son. Today I have become your father." So he's saying God promised this years back to David and all those guys, but now it's being fulfilled in us. I'm just reminded of that verse in Hebrews chapter 11, towards the end of the chapter, where it says that about Abraham and all these great heroes of the faith, that they died without receiving that which was promised, because only together with us can we be made perfect. And Paul's saying something very similar to that here. Let's move on into verse 34. He says, "The fact that God raised him from the dead, never to decay, is stated in these words. I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David. So it is stated elsewhere, you will not let your Holy One undergo decay." The promises not yet experienced by David are now fulfilled in Jesus Christ. "For when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep and he was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. But the one whom God raised from the dead did not undergo decay." So David decayed, so the promise couldn't be to him, but Jesus is the one to whom it applied. Verse 38. "Therefore, my brothers, I want you to know that through Jesus the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through him every everyone who believes is justified from everything from which you could not be justified by the law of Moses. So he's been very clear here. He's moving into an appeal for salvation. You see, without this, without getting into an appeal for salvation, without telling people how do you act upon this, how do you put this into action, you just have an exhortation. But Paul's not just here for an exhortation, he's here for gospel preaching. And gospel preaching always brings you to this point of decision. Verse 40. Take care that what the prophets have said does not happen to you. Look, you scoffers, wonder and perish, for I am going to do something in your days that you would never believe, even if someone told you. And that's a quote from Habakkuk in chapter 1, verse 5. And it was actually a prophecy of the Babylonians coming, that the Babylonians were going to come and destroy the temple and take the Israelites into captive. Is everybody hearing his words now? No. This is a serious threat. I mean, as far as doom and gloom preaching to Jews goes, this is about as serious as it gets. Verse 42. As Paul and Barnabas were leaving the synagogue, the people invited them to speak further about these things on the next Sabbath. And when the congregation was dismissed, many of the Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who talked with them and urged them to continue in the grace of God. So, okay, it's not a revival. Revival hasn't broken out in Pisidian Antioch the first time Paul preaches in the synagogue, but neither has persecution. Please come back and speak to us about the gospel again. Hey, that's always good news. And in fact, the word invited is literally, they begged Paul and Barnabas to come back again the next Sabbath. So this is good. This is great. And then where it says that there were those that followed them, and Paul and Barnabas talked with them and urged them to continue in the grace of God, it's they kept persuading them, is a better way of putting that. And when it says to continue, it doesn't mean they were already in the grace of God. To continue can mean one of two things. It say, well, continue is keep on doing what you're doing now. Or to continue is to keep going and press on in to what is there for you. So he's not just saying stay as you are. He's saying press on in, because this is leading to a goal. And the goal is Jesus. And now you need to continue on and embrace Jesus for yourself. And we'll stop there and we'll come back to that in episode 29, and we'll see just what did happen on the next Sabbath day. I do hope you'll join us for Upon This Rock episode 29. And for those of you from Drogheda who are watching this as part of your midweek Bible study, you'll notice on the video we got a little bit of a problem with the sun shining in on me. Afraid nothing I can do about that at the moment. But thank you for joining us for this Bible study. And I do hope you'll join us again next Wednesday night, 7:30 p.m. here in my study. Please do join us then. But until then, God bless you.